Thank you very much for the kind introduction and good morning to everyone. I would like to start my presentation by thanking all the other fellow participants for accepting my invitation to this conference. I'm really honored by your presence, and I'm absolutely certain that we are going to hear some really interesting presentations from you, so thank you very much. Before I actually dive into the actual topic of my presentation, I would like to give a quick introduction why energy was chosen as the topic of this half of the panel. In Europe, most of us took cheap energy for granted in the past few years. But last year it has taken a 180-degree turn, and we all experienced the consequences of an unstable energy supply on our skins. According to the report of the International Energy Agency, which was this 2022 World Energy Outlook, in one of the key findings of this report was that for the first time in a decade, because of the multiplying of the prices, the number of people without access to modern energy has been rising. Although we would like to think that this is only a European problem, in reality it's quite the opposite. For example, when we started our LNG imports into Europe, we were willing to pay a premium on it. This, in turn, has redirected the previous usual LNG routes towards Europe, which consequently resulted in massive energy shortages in developing nations such as, for example, Pakistan or Bangladesh. Due to these negative effects, the interest in energy and energy law has been very much increasing. More and more people deal with the topic. There are conferences and courses on the issue. And in this panel, we would like to contribute to this discourse by also addressing some of the contemporary challenges of energy law. So now I would like to turn my attention to the actual topic of my presentation. One of the key findings of the previously mentioned report was the fact that we are now focusing a lot more on energy supply and security. And in this one, establishing domestic generating capacity is becoming a key issue. In my presentation, I would like to address how this electricity generating capacity was establishing it was regulated in the past, how is it regulated today, and what are some of the contemporary challenges that we have. But before we go for the legislation, I think it's quite important to take a look at the energy mix of Hungary, and starting with the primary energy sources. So the two most important sources, as you can see, is oil and gas, with each around 30% market share. After that comes nuclear, which is around 15%. This has been a very steady source since the establishment of the Paks nuclear power plant. After that, another steady source is biomass and waste with around 11%. And the last one that is worth mentioning is coal with 5%, but it has been declining over the years. As in this presentation, I will focus more on electricity. I think it's also important to take a look at the electricity mix. And from electricity, unsurprisingly, it's nuclear that is the most important with 44%. After that comes gas with around 25%. And after that comes solar with around 12%, but it has been showing a huge increase in recent years. After that, there are some other sources like biomass and waste with around 11%. And there is, with around 4%, there is also a coal source. And wind is, surprisingly, in Hungary is only just less than 2%. So with this, I would like to focus now more on the legislation. And I would like to start it by introducing how the sector was regulated, with especially focusing on how generating capacity could have been established over the years. So the first piece of legislation that is worth mentioning is the 1888 Act on the Telegraph, Telephone, and other electrical installations. Even though this act was not electricity specific, but I think it's still worth mentioning because it had some provisions on electricity supply, and it was really early in time. But more importantly, the next step was the 1931 Act on the Development, Transmission, and Supply of Electricity. With regards to generating capacity, the Act stated that the most important thing was obtaining the licensing document. This was only possible by a tendering procedure, and in this tendering procedure, hydropower had a priority over any other source of electricity. This licensing document was rather simple. It had to include a few things like the location, the name of the operator, but also surprisingly it had to include the different sort of prices that they charge to customers. When the licensee obtained this licensing document, the next two steps were the construction license and after that the operation license, both of which were issued by the Minister of Trade. It can be said that this legislation was pretty modern, as it clearly separated between a private and the public spheres. After the communist takeover in Hungary, nationalization began in the sector as well, and the 1946 Act on the State Ownership of Power Plants and Transmission Lines was adopted. They reasoned this move by saying that this was very much necessary in the current economic climate, and there were no provisions on that this is only going to be a temporary thing, but they said that they are going to do some compensation, which in reality never happened. After this, in 1962, the Act on the Development, Transmission, and Distribution of Electricity was adopted, but due to the political climate, it did not really contain any rules on how new generating capacity can be established. But nevertheless, it differentiated between public plants and those plants that generate power for businesses, private plants. These later ones were only were able to get a license in cases if they wanted to be established to, in case of there is a supply issue with the public plants, or in case if they used waste, or if they were more efficient than the public ones. Before the regime change, the structure of the Hungarian electricity sector was very centralized. It was dominated by state-owned monopolies. However, it soon became quite apparent that there is a need for some structural change, and the previous Hungarian Electricity Trust Works was transformed into a limited liability company, MVM, Hungarian Electricity Works, and although still connected to MVM, but the power plants gained their own legal personality. In 1994, the Act on Electricity was adopted, and in it there were some quite detailed rules on how new generating capacity can be established. The process began with the Minister of Economy, who submitted the power plant establishment plan every second year, either to the government if the capacity was between 200 to 600 megawatts, or if it was over 600 megawatts, he submitted it to the parliament. Otherwise, the main role was in the licensing process was played by the Hungarian Energy Authority. The first stage of establishing a generating capacity was the preliminary licensing process, during which the authority looked at whether the plant was part of the previously mentioned power plant establishment plan. The subsequent step in the licensing process was the construction license, which was only issued for the limited amount of time. Finally, the last license that had to be obtained was, of course, the operating license. With this in hand, the licensee was able to generate electricity in a public plant over 20 megawatts of capacity, or in a private one over 50 megawatts of capacity. In case of plants that were public plants under 20 megawatts and in private ones under 51, no license had to be obtained, but the operator had to inform the authority upon beginning the operation. At this point in time, the Hungarian market worked on a single buyer basis, where MVM purchased the electricity and then sold it to the suppliers. In 1995, the privatization of the energy sector went down, but this was not without its own set of challenges, but now I will not mention these. Also, almost at the same time, the first liberalization package was adopted within the European Community, and due to our desire to join the community, the provisions of this directive were adopted in the 2001 Act on Electricity. Interestingly, this act opted for a dual market structure, where there was a difference between eligible customers and those who got electricity from public utility providers. With regards to establishing a generating capacity, that the act provided that the government is only responsible for setting energy policy requirements of new plants, and the Hungarian Energy Authority is who is licensing the process. Licenses are needed for plants over the capacity of 50 megawatts. under this, licensing is not needed, but if the plant is over 1 megawatt, then before beginning the operation, the authority has to inform, the authority had to be informed. For setting up a plant over the capacity of 50 megawatts, an establishment license had to be obtained from the authority, followed by a generating license. In this new act, the preliminary stage of licensing that I mentioned previously has been eliminated, and also the state's planning role has also disappeared. The risk of power plant establishment has been transferred to the investors. After the second liberalization package, the also now in force 2007 Act on Electricity was adopted that introduced a fully open market. Firstly, I think it's quite important to look at the definition, what is a power plant according to the Act, which is an on-site energy conversion facility that generates electricity using a primary energy source. This, compared to the previous legislation, now doesn't actually list these primary sources. Continuing with the spirit of the 2001 Act, also in this case, the establishment of this power plant became a commercial risk that was transferred to the investors, except for wind farms, about which I will talk a bit later on. The authority has to issue the licenses if the applications are in conformity with the requirements. The ASCEA Act discusses the different types of licenses, and so will I now. The first one that I would like to mention is the small plant combined license. This is an easier procedure to obtain a license. This is for plants between 0.5 megawatts and 50 megawatts. And this is basically a combined establishment and operation license. Construction can only begin after obtaining the license, and the license holder has to inform the authority and the transmission system operator 60 days prior to operation. The second license that I would like to mention is the principal license. This is for plants that are over 500 megawatts of capacity, and this step basically ensures that the authority can properly evaluate the plants in order to ensure the security of the whole electricity system. This happens prior to the regular steps that are listed after it. So the next regular step is the license for establishment. These are needed for plants that are over the capacity of 50 megawatts. So after the principal license, this also applies to the plants that are over the capacity of 500 megawatts. After obtaining this, the operation license can be obtained, which also applies for the plants over 500 megawatt, but in the case of the small plant, it's already in the combined license. So yeah, and this is only issued for a limited period of time. Regarding the practical application of this 2007 Act, it has to be said that, for example, in the second decade of this century, there have been basically no big or small power plant, conventional power plant constructions in Hungary. And what happened was basically there was a lot of support for solar power, so what have been mostly established were solar power plants. In the last part of my presentation, I would like to focus on two contemporary issues in Hungary. As I mentioned, there are different rules for wind power. So the licenses for wind farms can only be obtained to the power capacity extent that is determined by the government in light of the expected balance of the electricity system. The rules of establishing this generating capacity are not regulated in the previously mentioned Act on Electricity, but in a separate decree, which uses a tendering procedure. Also, this decree was later amended in 2016, and certain requirements were also introduced, such as, for example, that wind turbines cannot be taller than 100 meters, and also that wind turbines and wind farms cannot be located within the 12-kilometer vicinity of a built-up area. This basically, considering the Hungarian village structure and that wind power is not feasible everywhere, basically meant that it was very, very challenging to establish wind power anywhere in the country. This was reasoned to a certain degree by saying that wind power is very bad for the landscape. It's also very noise polluting, and it's very bad for birds. However, Hungary not too long ago submitted its updated draft national energy and climate plans to the Commission, in which there was much bigger emphasis on wind power. Until 2030, we plan to triple our now existent capacity, which still not be too much. But at least we can say that in the following years, there will be definitely some changes to the current legislation, and some of these restrictions on wind power will definitely be lifted. The second issue that I would like to talk about are the small household power plants. They were introduced in the Hungarian legislation by the 2007 Act on Electricity, which describes these small household plants as a plant which are connected to the low voltage grid and their capacity is not more than 50 kilowatt. It has to be said that these 99% of the time are solar plants. Also, there are some wind ones as well, but the overwhelming majority is solar. If these plants request the distributor, then the distributor has to buy the electricity for them for the same amount of money that they sell it. There were certain support schemes to make them more popular. The most important one was the balance sheet accounting. This was way favorable than other solutions within the EU, and this meant that they became super popular. In this balance sheet accounting, in accounting period, which in Hungary was 1 year and still is, the purchased amount of electricity is lowered by the produced amount of electricity. This worked so well that from 2012 until 2023, the number of these establishments increased by 100 times. They went from 1,800 installations to 212,000 installations. And their capacity right now is around 1,800 megawatts, which is more than what Paks has. However, it has its own set of challenges. As these sources are very volatile, they put a huge pressure on the grid. So after the 2022 energy crisis, when even more applications came in for these plants, there had to be some intervention. And they basically, to combat this excessive pressure on the grids, in October 26, a government decree was adopted that put a temporary, and I have to underline it, temporary end to the grid connection of those plants whose applications were submitted later than the 31st of October 2022. With this also, it has to be said that massive investments began in the upgrading the grid. And in March, a new decree was adopted that declared that the lifting of this ban can happen in certain areas if they put enough upgrades into the grid so that it can handle the new connections. So with this now I come to the conclusion. Well, I think the Hungarian electricity sector has went through a huge development. From a single buyer process, we arrived to a fully open market. And as we can see with the generating capacity, it was somewhat similar. It was driven by government decisions, and now it's more of a business commitment. However, it has to be said that for the greater good of the balance of the whole system, certain interventions are needed. But I think these might not be popular, but their purpose serves a clear objective. And the last thing that I would like to mention with regards to energy policy, that I think it's really important to have a proactive approach to energy, but I think it's also very important to have this flexible attitude. When something like this happens with the grid connections, then we can make these quite challenging decisions to combat these challenges. Thank you very much for your attention.